All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Jill Abney. I'm the Associate Director for the Teaching Center at the University of Kentucky, the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching, or CELT, as we call ourselves. And I'm here to chat about some critical approaches to general artificial intelligence, particularly related to research, especially for grad students or folks who are growing in a field, growing in a discipline, growing in a profession, and figuring out some ways to critically and thoughtfully approach tools that are just now sort of emerging. Well, that's not really fair. ChatGPT was released in November of 2022, but they continue to change and develop, and so it feels very much like it's always new and always changing. So just to give you an outline of some of the goals of what I'll go over in the coming time period. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the questions, trends, and developments around generative AI in the recent moment that impact the potential uses and approaches. I would often argue that we have to know how generative AI works in order to know when it's appropriate to use it, when it's not, and what we should be doing with it. And so that's one of the key steps. And then we'll also talk about strategies for using it effectively and developing your own critical AI literacy. I always give a couple of caveats when I do conversations about generative AI, especially around research, but it with any use at all. And that is that number one, the capabilities and sophistication of generative AI tools are constantly changing, and there is no one source for information about what generative AI is, what it can do, what it can't do. So there's no instruction manual. And so as a result, it can be a little confusing and discombobulating when we're trying to learn about it for ourselves in relationship to our own fields. I would also like to say that there are certainly valid concerns over the ethics of use, whether it's how it was created, the way the data was obtained, the way employees who are forced to kind of sort through information and training data are compensated and the traumatic content that they view on a daily basis, or it could be ethics around intellectual property, copyright, and so on. There's also a number of concerns about biases that are present in the output of these large language models. The training data has bias present within, and so the outputs will recreate those biases in a number of ways. There are also hallucinations is a term that has sort of been adopted to mean when AI gets things wrong. There's a very logical reason for that based on how AI works, and I'll show you in just a minute. But hallucinations continue to happen in generative AI tools and their outputs. So there's also a large conversation about the environmental impact of these tools. How much resources do they use? These are valid questions that are continuing to be explored. They're hard questions to explore, but something that you should be aware of. Privacy concerns, I'll say from the jump that things that you put into these AI tools are not private. They might feel like it's a very intimate conversation between you and a person sounding entity, but that is not the case. Even if it's a paid ChatGPT subscription, unless you have a closed system or a walled garden or something that you've downloaded to your device and then run it separately, like Llama is an open access tool that you can do that with. Your inputs into the chat are saved. Okay. And then, of course, conversations about intellectual property apply as well when you're talking about these tools. I've got a few headlines to the right there recently on the slide that demonstrate some of the questions and how they're continuing to be part of the conversation related to the bias that's present, the environmental demands. And so these are just a few headlines out of many. So all this to say, there's a lot going on with generative AI. It can do a lot of things. It's also not really great at doing a lot of things. And so it's helpful to know what that is and what the costs are in using it, not just in the environment or monetarily, but also in the cost to your cognitive abilities and your ability to do things on your own. So the goal here is to develop some critical literacies around AI through experimentation, curiosity, and some healthy skepticism. This is an old image and when I say old in AI time, it's like, I think January 2024 is when I had this created. And so ChatGPT has updated and it does a little better now. So that's not really the point of this, but I like to start here because I think experimenting with generative AI tools is where we learn the limitations and capabilities of these tools. I was doing a session for College of Health Sciences in January of 2024, and I asked ChatGPT, at the time that model was 4.0, to create an image of a shiny, fancy robot in a cool gym doing a bench press. And this image on the left is the first image that it created for me. Well, that's not a bench press. And I told it that, but I was also being very coy about the feedback. I could have said, no, 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 a bench press is where you're laying back on the bench, blah, 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 blah. But I didn't. I just said it's not a bench press. So then it creates this image, which is more of an exercise that more folks do, but still not a bench press. And so the third image, when I pushed back, was this one. And I thought this was really fascinating, and I screen captured it quickly because I think it communicates really well what can be difficult to talk with students, faculty, staff about the abilities of generative AI and the tendencies that AI has to kind of make small errors, right? This is a fancy looking gym. It's a fancy looking robot. It's shiny. There are weights. It's believable in a lot of different ways, if it were believable that a robot was doing weight training. But what's not effective for this image is that rep would really damage that robot's ability to function. And so these types of things happen in the written versions of large language model outputs. They happen in the video versions, the sound versions, little glitches, little moments where AI is giving an output and something's just a little off. And you, as a person who maybe or maybe not has visited a gym and done bench press, could at least know that regardless, you wouldn't want to do that exercise in particular. So there are things that we bring to the table that generative AI can't quite do as well as we do. I want to pause for a minute and talk just a little bit about how generative AI works, so that we can talk about why that matters. And I'll preface that I'm not a computer scientist, so this is sort of a cursory overview, but it's enough to kind of help us figure out some things about what we might want to use it for and also things we wouldn't want to use it for. Generative AI, and when I'm talking here about the writing versions of large language models like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., these are predictive. And so they use patterns that they learn from training data, large, billions of tokens, as they're called, which are pieces of words or words. They use those patterns to predict stochastically a likely word that comes next in a response to a prompt. And so you're prompting in the chat of a chatbot prompts those learned patterns to spit out a mathematical guess of the next, the likely response to that. So it can feel like it knows things or it thinks, but that is not, in fact, the mechanism of a large language model. It is predicting the next best word based on learned patterns. Now, one thing that has happened since the launch of initially ChatGPT 3.5 is the addition of retrieval augmented generation, which or RAGs as they're called. This adds some element of informational search and retrieval to the process, but not in a way that avoids all challenges that come from a predictive model. So when you enter, and most of the chatbots now, like ChatGPT, Claude, etc., are infused with a little bit of that retrieval augmented generation. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but there's still a lot of predictive components to that. So if we're thinking about how that works, then it's important to think about, well, when it might be challenging or maybe not effective to use it. So let's think about, I don't know, a medical example. You're facing a case study where you're trying to figure out a possible diagnosis and treatment plan. We have to keep in mind that it's a predictive tool. And so it's guessing, and it might guess right the words in the order in which they should come, and it might guess wrong, or it might guess somewhere in the middle of that. So those are ways that we have to be critical of the outputs that come from those tools. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we're not going to talk too much about the computer science details. I do want to demonstrate a little bit of what I mean by guessing the next best word. And I'm going to use a it's called a GPT that our director, Trey Knatzer here at CELT created. And it's a little game that you can play, and it's linked on the slide deck that I'll share. What word am I thinking? And this will kind of show you that predictive nature of these tools. It says, okay, let's play. It's going to give us the beginnings of a sentence. And this is essentially a game. It'll give you a score. And there are 5 words, the top 5 words that it says are most likely to come next are "it knows it" and "I don't." And so I'll guess one. The sentence here is, "The quiet garden seemed to invite someone to sit." And I'm going to guess "read" as the next word in this sentence. And it's going to tell me, did I guess one of the 5? No, I did not. And so I get 0 points for that. In its words, it says relax, rest, reflect, dream, talk. And so now it's moved on. The next round is, "The quiet garden seemed to invite someone to sit and relax." And I'm going to say, while. Nope, nope, not. I'm not. See, I'm not ChatGPT. This is maybe a test. I'm not an Android bot. Okay. Quietly thinking. No, I'm failing miserably at this. Under a. Okay, I got number 2 there. Let's say tree for the next one. Okay, I got the number 1 there. So you get the point, right? This is a sort of predictive nature. And another thing to keep in mind is the tools are not always giving you the number 1 answer. That's why the output that comes from these tools is never the same. These are novel or new content outputs that are being generated every time. So you and your friend could put the same questions to the same bot at the same time, and it will come up with different answers, slightly different. They may sound similar, they might have similar tone or points to it, but still. So here's the link to that custom GPT if you'd like to play along with it. Now, if you don't have a paid version of ChatGPT, I do not, and so it would have kicked me off after about 9 or 10 rounds, I think, of those questions. Other things that you can kind of do, and this is targeted more towards undergrads, but it's there are ways that generative AI works that I think I'm going to share with you this little game that I made using Claude, simply because I think it shows us something about the nature of the assumptions that generative AI makes when it creates something. I was doing a session for some undergrad classes, and I wanted them to engage with a conversation about what is ethical use of generative AI and what's not. And I asked the students to choose their level. This is going to give us a scenario. Alex uses ChatGPT to generate an outline for a history essay, and then writes the essay himself. Then you get to guess, like, is this questionable use? Is it academic dishonesty, or is it appropriate use? We're going to say appropriate use. Nope, doesn't agree, and that's fine. I think the real trick here is it depends on the instructor's guidelines, right? Or if this was a more advanced example of you're trying to publish a study, what's the journal's guidelines, or what's your dissertation committee's guidelines, or whatever the case may be. Interestingly enough, when I went through this scenario, and we can go quickly, and I'll just do this. I'll just make guesses so that we get to the end. because I want to show you this phrase here. Not bad, but consider reviewing institutional AI policies. What's interesting is when I built that, I did not give it institutional AI policies. I did not tell it any policies, and I didn't even tell it what institution I work for. So it's making up something based on what it thinks it should say, based on learned patterns. I never told it to do a thing, and it's not built on any particular institutional guidelines. So interesting, I think, to note that. And you can play that game. I disagree with some of its answers too. So, say what you will. For those of you that are kind of new to generative AI, I think it's somewhat helpful to know that there are lots of different versions of generative AI out there. Your basic large language models that sort of dominate the industry right now are ChatGPT, Claude. Gemini is Google's version. Meta is Facebook Meta's version. Mistral is a French company. DeepSeek is sort of a recent emergence from a company in China. Although, if you're interested in using DeepSeek, Perplexity has also taken that open access code and put it on American servers, so you can use that as well. Copilot is Microsoft's version, and then Perplexity is a common one. We talked a little bit about large language models, which they generate text. They're sort of the standard ChatGPT, but they now include some RAG, some retrieval augmented generation. There are also large multimodal models, and some of these are blended into LLM. So you can ask ChatGPT to make an image for you, and it will. You can ask Gemini, the paid version, to do that. Claude doesn't make images. Copilot does, but that's because they have large multimodal models built in. These multimodal models do all sorts of things, not the ones in those tools particularly, but there are audio generating models, there are video generating models. Google just released Veo a couple of weeks ago, which can generate about 8 seconds of video based on a description that you make. But I want to lean into retrieval augmented generative tools because I think those are most interesting for folks who are doing a lot of research or inclined to do some research, because this tool embeds some search and retrieval with the addition of the large language model's tendency to use learned patterns from training data to formulate answers. Some of the examples of these tools include CELT.ai, Consensus, SciSpace, Elicit. There's quite a few. I'm going to pull up CELT for us to do a little demo here. The research assistant in CELT has a chat, just like most chatbots do, and you can ask a question related to whatever it is you're interested in. I'll put something semi-medical, even though I'm not really a medical person. So what are the latest studies saying about the impact of artificial sweeteners on brain health? And when you hit go, it will start to do two things simultaneously. It is looking for particular scholarly journals that it has access to, because CELT has contracts with some databases, not all, but some databases with peer-reviewed journals, so that it can pull publications and then consult those. And then it uses the information within those sources, excuse me, to enhance the prompt. And then the prompt gets spit into the large language model's ability to generate text, and it starts to generate a sort of lit review of sorts. Okay. So it's still working on it. It's telling me it's fact checking its answer. And then once it's done, you can see that it will walk you through, as I said before, a very sort of lit review style piece of prose, where it links to specific articles that it has decided speaks to this question. In addition to that, you can go to the abstract of that article, and you'll also see what other publications cite. These are called smart citations. That's what CELT calls them, their proprietary thing. So what other folks have cited that article, see the references used by this publication, and then also it tells you how many of these citations mention it versus support it or contrast to the arguments of that article. Now, I find this to be a little bit basic because, as with most scholarship, it's far more complex and nuanced what's happening within the full text of an article, methods, findings, whether it's actually proving or disproving something. Sometimes it's just adding to the literature, and it's not about agreeing or contrasting. There are definitely some limitations to tools like this. And I would argue that a lot of that lives in the nuance of the language. So we can kind of see what comes up here. I have another example that's based in my home discipline of history, which I'll break down a little bit more. But this says recent findings indicate that artificial sweeteners could interfere with neural communication through their interactions with intestinal sweet taste receptors, which play a critical role in insulin secretion. For instance, and then that for instance is a sign marker for us as readers that what's said here is connected to what's said here, right? And the only way for us to know is if this, for instance, is a fair connector word or a series of words to this study, is if we read said studies, right? And there are occasions where that doesn't necessarily play out. The other thing you'll notice is there's only, I think it limits it to like 11 or 12 articles that it's referring to. There may be some pivotal studies or pivotal articles that are not mentioned here simply because they're not present in the databases that this has proprietary agreements with. So that's pretty notable. Let me show you an example from something that I'm a little bit more familiar with, and you're likely not, but bear with me while I nerd out about history. So I'm a British historian, and the Luddites were a famous group that sort of went against mechanization in a field of textile work in British history. And I asked it, to what extent was the Luddite movement part of a broader political awakening for the English working class? And when I go through these cite.ai lit reviews or something else that is an RAG model, I look at first an initial read, and I'm like, what's initially wrong to me? Just what's my knee-jerk reaction? What's initially right? And the first thing I notice is that it takes the phrase that I use, a political awakening, and then it tells me that it is often interpreted as that. That's not really accurate. It's a very debated point. I also noticed that it refers to a source that it dates as 2010, which is Frederick Engels' The English Working Class. And that was actually written in 1844. It's probably just a new edition. And so that's alarming to me already, that the earliest reference it's got was 1844. There are certainly more historians talking about that now than before. There's no mention of the size or breadth of the revolt. It was very small, and actually really surprising that it lives in the imaginations of people so frequently. People talk about Luddites all the time, especially in AI world. Then when I start looking closer, there are a few accurate things. It mentions the Industrial Revolution, which is important. It does mention that Luddism was more than just an anti-machine movement. It was about the right to make a living the way you were trained to make a living, even though it should be getting easier because of this machinery. And then I have my silly meme here to remind you that when you're using these tools, to be suspicious, because you might be lulled into this sense of, ooh, that's a lit review and I don't have to do any work. No, that is where the work happens, is when you embed yourself in a field. You have to know the studies back and forth, and you have to kind of know what's missing, what's not, what's inaccurate, what's not. I also dug into some of the articles that it was presenting. It wasn't just the Ingalls source, but it did mention a few other studies, but most of them were about class histories, not just the Luddites. So there are plenty of studies it could have named, but it didn't. And that points back to the limitation of some of these tools, that they do not have all-encompassing access to all existing research. So therefore, they're always limited. One, CELT is notably weak in areas of the humanities, of social sciences, especially the humanist kind of leaning social sciences. It's a little bit better at medicine and those type health service type fields, but there's always going to be limitations to what it has access to. And I also want to kind of point out the tendency of AIs to be sycophantic. So or to sort of give you what you want, if you need a definition of sycophancy. If AI companies want you to keep using their tool, they want it to make you feel good about the things that you're hearing from it, right? And so in my initial prompt, I said, to what extent was it a political awakening? And so it hears kind of a tone in my response is like, oh, it was a political awakening and I need to prove to this person that it's that. Well, I pushed back because it was not necessarily, in fact, part of a broader movement. This is debated. And so my response back to it was, this seems far too certain about ideas and concepts that are still debated in historical circles. Revisit the question and do better. And it immediately changed its tone, and it borrows sort of the language from what I had said in this pushback question, which is it remains a complex and debated topic. They have been interpreted in various ways, a very different tone from the initial post or output that I had received the first time. So what did it take to get here? Me knowing something about the topic so that I could push back a little, and I could still push back some. But this is a key to using generative AI tools, whether it's ChatGPT, CELT, or anything, is you have to know to push back, because no output is infallible and every output can always be improved. And it's just one tool out of many tools. Like there are databases and workflows that are tried and true in your discipline, in your field. Use those, and you can maybe dabble in CELT a little bit, but don't take it as this is the end all be all. Some guidelines or essentials for students, and this can be for anything from an undergraduate student to a graduate student to a medical professional doing research. You need to know your company or course or journal's guidelines about the use of AI. Like there is no AI police out there, at least not right now in the US, but there are folks in individual places and arenas have the right to say what is and isn't allowed in terms of AI. So you'll find journals that are saying AI can't be used in any way in this particular from submissions to this publication, or you might have graduate committees or advisors saying no AI. So you need to pay attention to that. If they do say, okay, AI is okay in these ways, then follow the guidelines that you're given, and not using it anymore. And if you have questions, make sure you're asking those, regardless of who it is. Number two, I think, is something that's really important, and a lot of folks have a hard time with this one, is you want to use it intentionally. Generative AI is okay at some things, it really good at some things, and then also not great at others. And so we don't want to be using AI just because it's there. It costs resources. It cognitively offloads things that you should be doing yourself. And you want to use it purposefully, like use it for the work that it's good at, but not just to do the work for you. You also need to acknowledge and cite it if you're using it. I say that to my colleagues, even if they're using it to help them draft an email. I think that what is helpful in this moment where anybody can use AI to draft anything is transparency. And so if you're using it, acknowledge it. And when you're acknowledging it in research or scholarly work, you can check your style guidelines. So whatever guidelines your field tends to lean toward they should have some statements on the acknowledgement of AI, because it goes beyond, like, ChatGPT said this on September 19th, because it's always generating novel content. I could put in the same question as you and it'll put out different things. So it needs to be more about um, how you interact with it. I'll show you a slide that will help with that. Lastly, an essential is guard your data. If you have protected data that has been sort of collected as a result of an IRB proposal, you should not put that into ChatGPT because it is not private. And any plans for you to use AI as a tool for a research project should be included in your IRB proposal and spelled out explicitly. And any use of it beyond that is not really okayed by IRB. You can find more on the Institutional Research Board's website on that note. But don't share sensitive personal data and don't share confidential data or data that's meant to be protected. So, okay, those are all the kind of like, these are the caveats, these are the challenges, these are these are the scary things. If you're going to use it, which, I mean, I'll confess, I use it. I teach a faculty learning community about generative AI and how we approach it in education. And so I'm using it all the time just to learn what it's able to do. There are strategies for effective use. When you're using AI, it's helpful to tell generative AI who it is or what it is, like give it a persona. By using those words, it helps unlock some of the patterns that it's learned to give you more effective outputs. You can also explain the situational context. So, for instance, one of the things I like to use it for is if I have a faculty group of 25 and I'm going to meet with them 5 times over the semester, and I want them to meet as many different people as they can in that group of 25, and they're going to be in groups of 5. I'll give it initials of the people. I don't give full names. And I'll say, arrange these initials or these people represented by initials in as many different groups as possible for 5 meetings. Think like an educational developer because you're wanting to ensure that they're meeting, so I'm giving it a clear example. I even like build out the first group first and say, do this 4 more times. And that gives it an example of what's effective and what is the prime or the main criteria for effective output. Also encourage students and researchers to control for behavior. So you need to establish rules and boundaries for what the generative AI tool is being asked to do. And if it doesn't do what you tell it to do, you can stop it. For instance, if you're trying to have it just look at some notes that you jotted down and ask some questions about those notes about your research, and it starts trying to spit out like, well, here's the way you should analyze this, or here's the way, and you didn't ask it to do that. You specifically asked it not to do that, in fact. Then you can hit stop and you can say, I told you not to do that. I'd rather that thought not be in my brain because I'm trying to work through this in different channels or something like that. So those are some key steps. Number 5 is I have an asterisk beside it because that's becoming less, or actually becoming more debated as to whether this is a helpful tip. Used to be in early stages of large language models, a step-by-step approach is helpful because you break it down for the large language model. However, in the last 2 or 3 years, more and more AI companies have built in what's called reasoning models, where the AI has been trained on the back end to break things into steps or to come up with ideas for what steps should be given the task or the prompt that's been named. And so some folks are saying if you break it into steps and then it goes into it to break it into steps, it actually jumbles it a little bit more. So experiment, see what works for you. And then you want to provide it with examples and references, and always engage with dialogue. You're pushing back, you're going back and forth. It should be a conversation. It should be engaging with AI. There's not a perfect prompt you can drop in and just be like, ooh, look what AI did. I guarantee you, if you scrutinize it, there's some places where it falls apart a little bit. So now that's sort of strategies for optimal use, but I also think there are some steps that those of us who are keen to be ethical in our use of generative AI, there are some strategies we can use here. I think it's important to build our human capabilities or capacity to do things because, as I showed you with the breakdown of that site.ai output in my field, it takes some knowledge in a field to be able to be critical about some other outputs and thoughts from, say, an AI tool. And you don't get those unless you have the critical thinking to look at something and say, what about this is helpful? What about this is not? It also takes some creativity. When you have I gave faculty a challenge where they were supposed to use AI to come out with the most surprising and thoughtful or unique output. And when they just said, hey, AI, be creative, it wasn't very creative at all. But when they gave it a nugget, a little tidbit of creativity or something interesting, that's when it's most creative. That's when it's most effective. So you are providing what you put into it makes a huge difference on what comes out of it. Using ethical judgment, using your emotional intelligence, your strategic thinking, your leadership, these are all things that AI is not going to be able to replicate. And so if you don't put yourself in those situations to practice it, in your professional or research lives, then you're not going to be ready when the time comes that a high stakes moment presents itself, and you need to be able to use those skills. So you do, I think, for ethics' sake, need to be AI literate. So understanding that AI predicts the next best word, or that it's not a glorified search engine. It's not a super powered research machine. Like, it's simply a chat bot that's spitting out phrases. That matters in how it's used. And so by being literate in what it can and can't do, that allows you to recognize the appropriate professional applications. Now, specific tools that have AI embedded in them, there are a number I know that are used in the medical world. And those, you should ask questions about those when you're presented with those in your professional environment. But always consider privacy, consider cost, consider environmental impact, etc. And that leads you to sort of weighing the costs. Like, what is the cost environmentally or monetarily, of course, but also are there costs to you and your ability to conduct your work and your research if you offload something to a tool that may or may not be able to do it? Are there potential costs to your reputation or to your ability to contribute to the research world? And you want to make sure that you are doing the work. AI should be an augment to the work you are doing, not something that replaces the work for you. If you're skipping the challenges that come with research or with your academic sort of growth, then you're kind of missing the point. This is misuse, I would label it. So make sure it's augmenting your work, not replacing it. And then always acknowledge and attribute any use of AI that you're using. This is a very large kind of text-filled slide, so I'd invite you to pause the recording and kind of read over it in detail if you're interested in details about how to acknowledge or cite. I'm not going to read it to you, but one of the things I want to emphasize is the citation of AI use is not simply stating, I use this tool on this date. What it needs to require quite often is more like an appendix of, this is the prompt I started with, these are the ways I used it, but here's how the work is my own. And you should probably include the type of tool beyond just the name, because there are different models that come out and updates and so on. So you should always probably be the primary author and also the primary thinker of a project, and AI is always a supplemental tool. And I can summarize all that with this one phrase, which is avoid AI simply for expedience and productivity. Instead, identify the places where the addition of AI actually enhances your work. And so the human in the loop is absolutely necessary. And if there's not a human kind of touching the work, then we can't necessarily trust it. If you're wondering, well, I don't even know where I would use it. I think there are a lot of places that it can be helpful, especially in research, brainstorming, enhancing your creativity as you look for complex solutions to complex problems. It can provide some feedback, but I have an asterisk there because I think the predictive nature of the way AI models work needs to remind us that it's not deeply engaging with your words and ideas, but rather based on those words and ideas, predicting likely words that will placate you. It can be a study partner, it can be a question generator, and help simulate in different scenarios that you can play through to practice skills that you might need. If you're looking at data and whether or not AI is a useful tool for analyzing data, then I highly recommend practicing what is good research practice. And that is, you should be able to do, check, and verify all the things you're asking an AI tool to do for you. Because if you can't check, verify, assess that output, then I would argue it's not appropriate to rely on that tool. That's a really important part of research is replicability. And one of the challenges of generative AI is it's kind of a black box. The folks who made it don't necessarily understand why it does the things it does. There's a very long paper by Claude where they went into trying to map out or structure how Claude actually works. Anthropic is the parent company of Claude. And so they made it, but they don't even know how or why it does the things it does. So if you need to be able to sort of account for your research methods and your steps in analyzing data, if that happens in a black box, you may or may not be able to do that. Right. So don't rely on a tool that you can't check it. So just to summarize, I think AI is a really powerful tool, and it is good at some things. It's also not very good at others, but that we need to find ways to kind of stay conversant with the constant changes, to develop our critical literacies, and also to keep doing the hard things where learning happens so that we can do those in high stakes moments and answer to our methods and our results accordingly. So, thank you all.